Rome feared no one, or so it claimed. With its legions, its roads, its gods and laws, the empire stretched across continents. It crushed kings, toppled temples, and silenced resistance. But there was one enemy it could not conquer by force alone. One power that held no territory, commanded no army, yet terrified the empire's very soul. They were the Druids. To the Romans, the Druids were not just priests. They were agitators, shadow leaders, and prophets of rebellion. They stood outside the system, untaxed, untouched, and unconquered. They answered not to emperors, but to the earth, the stars, and ancient gods whose names Rome dared not speak aloud. And so, a different kind of war began. This was not a campaign for land, or gold, or glory. It was a war for memory, for control of meaning. The Druids held something Rome could never understand: the power of belief, unchained from empire. The war came not with declarations, but with torches, not with swords alone, but with fire, fear, and erasure. Sacred groves were burned, oral traditions, centuries old, were extinguished in silence. Druidic wisdom, passed from mouth to mouth under moonlit oaks, vanished without a trace. Rome didn't just want to defeat the Druids, it wanted to forget them. But the past doesn't die so easily, and even now, in the shadows of ruined temples and the mist of forgotten forests, their voices still whisper. This is the story of how Rome tried to silence a soul, and why it failed. To understand why Rome feared the Druids, we must first understand what the Druids represented, not just to their people, but to the very idea of empire. The Druids were more than priests. They were the architects of belief, the guardians of ancestral law, the voice of memory in a world ruled by the sword. They held no political office, yet commanded immense influence. A Druid could stop a war with a single word, crown or unmake a king with a single ritual. Their authority was not built on wealth or military strength, but on wisdom, tradition, and the trust of generations. That, to Rome, was terrifying. Because Rome was not merely a military power, it was an ideological machine. Its dominance wasn't complete until its language, gods, and laws replaced those it conquered. But the Druids stood in the way. They preserved a world that was ancient, organic, and radically independent. They taught without books, judged without courts, ruled without thrones, and their knowledge was secret, guarded, oral, inaccessible to Roman hands. Worse still, they united the tribes. In a land of fragmented clans and rival warlords, the Druids were the thread that wove the Celts into something greater. They traveled between tribes, mediated disputes, invoked shared myths and sacred traditions. They were, in every sense, the soul of Celtic resistance. To Julius Caesar, this was unacceptable. In his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, he wrote of the Druids with thinly veiled contempt and palpable fear. He described them as religious fanatics who conducted human sacrifices, stirred rebellion, and corrupted the minds of warriors. Whether true or not, these portrayals served a clear purpose: to demonize the Druids, to justify their extermination. Because how do you conquer a people who do not fear death, but revere it? How do you break a culture whose laws live not on parchment, but in memory? You erase the keepers of that memory. Thus, Rome set its sights not on the warrior, but on the Druid. Not on the sword, but on the word. They understood that as long as the Druids lived, so did a Celtic identity, untethered to Rome. And so began a campaign unlike any other, a war not for territory, but for the mind. Not to enslave a people, but to sever them from their spirit. Because to control the present, Rome had to bury the past, and the Druids were living proof that some truths do not kneel to empire. It was 60 CE. The Roman conquest of Britannia was in full force. Fortresses built, tribes subdued, roads carved through ancient soil. But one island stood untouched. One last sanctuary. Modern-day Anglesey, off the coast of Wales. To the Romans, it was just another strategic target. To the Celts, it was the heart of their spiritual world. Mona was the final stronghold of the Druids, a sacred place where the ancient rites were preserved, where knowledge passed in whispers beneath sacred oaks, where future leaders were trained in the shadows of eternity. And Rome knew it. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, cold, calculated, and ruthless, led his legions to the shores of Mona. They expected resistance. They expected swords and shields. But what they found was something else entirely. As the Roman ships approached, the cliffs above were lined with Druids. Cloaked in black, arms outstretched, they chanted in tongues older than Latin. Their voices echoed across the water, unnatural and unshaken. Women stood beside them, shrieking like furies, hair wild, faces painted. To the disciplined Roman soldiers, it wasn't just a battlefield. It was a nightmare. But orders were orders. The Romans charged ashore, cutting down anything that moved. Groves that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash. Sacred altars were desecrated. Monuments toppled. People, elders, women, children were slaughtered without mercy. It was extermination. Tacitus, the Roman historian, described the scene with unease, not as a triumph, but as a horror. The soldiers hesitated, shaken by the ferocity of what they were doing, yet the machine of empire could not be stopped. This was not merely a battle for territory, it was an assault on identity, on memory, on the very soul of a people. Rome did not just burn forests, it burned stories, songs, traditions, passed from tongue to tongue for hundreds of years. The destruction of Mona was a symbolic decapitation, an attempt to sever the Celtic world from its heart and spirit. But what the Romans failed to understand was this: ideas do not burn so easily. The Druidic flame, though dimmed, was not extinguished. It lived on in folklore, in sacred hills, in whispers carried on the wind. And in that act of destruction, Rome revealed something deeper: how much it feared what it could not understand. Mona was never just a place. It was a library without walls, a temple without stone, a beacon of resistance wrapped in silence and shadow. And when the Romans left, victorious and bloody, they did not leave peace behind. They left a haunting. Rome burned the groves, silenced the chants, and slaughtered the priests. On the surface, they won. The Druids vanished from history's pages. No monuments, no scriptures, no resistance. It seemed the empire had done what it always did: conquered not just a people, but their past. But they had made one fatal miscalculation: belief cannot be beheaded. The Druids were not built on stone, they were built on memory. Their teachings lived in breath, in song, in the rhythm of nature, and though their voices were silenced, the echoes lingered. As the Roman Empire marched forward, a strange thing began to happen. Across Gaul and Britannia, new stories emerged. Stories of wandering holy men who lived in forests, of saints who talked to trees and healed the sick with herbs, of holy wells and sacred hills, still revered, even as crosses replaced standing stones. It was as if the Druidic spirit had simply changed its mask, slipping into the robes of early Celtic Christianity, surviving through transformation rather than defiance. Sacred days like Imbolc, Beltane, and Samhain, once Druidic festivals, remained cloaked in new meaning, yet pulsing with ancient roots. Rome had burned the body, but the soul had fled into myth, into folklore, into the soil itself. Peasants still left offerings at sacred springs. Elders still passed down tales of wise ones in the woods. The groves grew back, quietly, patiently, while Rome decayed in marble silence. Even in death, the Druids resisted. Because you cannot kill a symbol that was never meant to be seen. You can only chase its shadow. And perhaps that was the Druids' greatest magic. Not prophecy, not ritual, but endurance. The quiet, defiant endurance of a worldview that refused to be erased, that outlived legions, emperors, and flames. Rome's empire collapsed under its own weight. Its gods faded, its cities crumbled, but the memory of the Druids survived, in whispered stories, in moss-covered stones, in the sacred hush of ancient forests. They had no temples left, but they had become the forest itself. And long after Rome turned to ruin, someone, somewhere, still looked to the trees and remembered. Rome tried to silence them, with fire, with fear, with steel, but the Druids were never just men in robes. They were memory, mystery, resistance. You can destroy a body, you can erase a name, but you cannot extinguish an idea whose roots are deeper than stone, an idea born in the land itself. The Romans may have won the battle, but did they win the war? Centuries later, the forests are still there. Ancient festivals still sparkle in modern forms. People still gather in stone circles, still whisper prayers into the wind, still look up at the stars with questions the Druids once answered. What if the Druids were never truly defeated, but transformed? What if their wisdom still resonates in the trees, the stars, and the stories we tell? Now it's your turn to speak up. Are they dangerous rebels or guardians of a sacred balance? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. If this story moves you, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to Whispering Myths, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next forgotten story. Because history doesn't belong to emperors, it belongs to those who remember. And sometimes, the most powerful truths are those whispered in the dark.